What's the creepiest real-life story someone has ever told you? Story 1. I live near a camp that I used to attend as a child. When I was 7, there was a counselor at the camp who was Russian, the camp having a very large staff exchange program with many different countries, and he was very weird. Other counselors said he was incredibly fast, and during staff-only campfires he would catch, skin, and eat live rabbits. He could do this crazy sleeper hold move, which was essentially a strangling move that knocked you out for a few seconds, after which you would come to and be fine a minute later. I saw him do it to another counselor once, and the guy was out for about 10 seconds, after which he was forbidden to ever do it again. However, kids got curious and started asking him to do the move, and he would do it in secret, but he increased the severity of his holds, which in turn kept the kids knocked out for longer periods of time. One day a camper went missing. He was not in his bunk, despite going to bed with his cabin that night. They did a camp-wide search, keeping all of us on the soccer field for about 2 hours, and eventually the counselors had to start searching the water. They found his body under the sailing dock, completely unconscious. He was alive but very unresponsive, and he had clear strangle marks around his neck. Everyone knew who it was. They arrested the Russian guy and deported him back to Russia. It later turned out they never even sent an exchange counselor at all, and nobody ever figured out who he really was. Story 2. My 4-year-old daughter was supposedly asleep when I heard noises coming from her upstairs bedroom. I tried to listen but could not make out what was being said. I approached the room and she stopped talking, so thinking I had alarmed her, I went inside. At the time, she was sharing the room with her 3-year-old sister. I walked in and saw my 4-year-old sitting up in bed, smiled and asked if everything was okay. She said yes, but her sister said they were keeping her awake. I asked who, and my 4-year-old apologized and said she had been talking. When I asked who she was talking to, my 3-year-old sat up and said the girl in the window told her I was coming. Completely panicked, I asked who the girl was, and they both said a girl comes and stands in front of the window at night and talks to them. Not knowing what else to do, I tucked them in and stayed outside their door for a while. The next day I asked about the girl, and they said she came back but was mad. I waited a few days and asked again, and my 4-year-old said the girl in the window was still mad. I forgot about it for about a week until my wife asked who the girls were talking to upstairs. Terrified, I ran up and found both girls sitting under the window, looking up. They turned to me and asked if I wanted to meet the girl, and when they turned back around, disappointed, they said she had left. It has been about 5 years since then, and I have never heard about the girl in the window again. Story 3. I live in a party house, and enough messed up things happen here on a normal day, but you really do not want to be here alone. I am the only roommate who can handle it, and even then, I have seen some truly terrible things in my life. I was home alone one night, and I was certain of it because all my roommates were in Minneapolis for Gay Pride Week. I had planned to throw a party but decided against it, checked the house, and locked up for the night. Around midnight, I heard the dog whimpering at my door, so I got up to let him out, and while he was outside, I thought I heard a door slam upstairs. At first, I assumed it was nothing, maybe a breeze, but the night was completely calm. As I let the dog back in, I heard a rapid series of loud slams and started to think someone might be messing with me. I grabbed a butcher knife and cautiously headed upstairs, and when I reached the top, every door was standing open, which was unsettling since my roommates usually shut them when they were gone. As I walked down the hallway to check the bathroom, I heard a loud crash downstairs, and moments later the dog sprinted past me and hid in the bathroom behind me. Completely shaken, I went downstairs to investigate, saw nothing unusual, and stood still for a moment until I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned just in time to see my front door slam shut on its own and then fling itself open, and that was the moment I got out of the house as fast as I could. Story 4. 10 years ago, about 2 years after my mother had died, my dad was getting remarried. Before my stepmom officially moved in, we had to clean out a large portion of the house because we were consolidating 2 families' worth of belongings. One morning while we were cleaning, my babysitter and I found a fancy mug that had belonged to my mother with the emblem of her college on it, and we accidentally left it in the upstairs office. A few hours later, my dad came home from work, and suddenly the mug was downstairs in the kitchen, sitting on top of a sample of the wedding invitations. No one had touched it since that morning. We joked about the haunted mug for a while, saying it was my mom giving her approval of the wedding, and nothing happened again for some time, until a little over a year after they were married. One day my stepmom misplaced her car keys and spent about half an hour searching every corner of the kitchen for them, walking around the island counter countless times, which had been thoroughly checked. However, on what must have been around the 50th lap, she suddenly saw her keys sitting on one of the corners, with the mug placed right next to them. After that, we put the mug on a high shelf, and it has not moved since. Story 5. Up until I was about 6 or 7 years old, I kept having very strange dreams. They were almost like watching a television show where I would see a woman's life play out through a series of events. I did not know who this woman was, only that I kept seeing her in my dreams. Most of the scenes were random, like her coming home from work one day and discovering that her oldest daughter had locked her younger sister out of the house without clothes on. I also had dreams where I watched this woman physically harm her children. I saw this woman and her boyfriend fall into substance use, and I watched them inject substances long before I even understood what that meant. I even watched this woman die of acquired immune deficiency syndrome in a hospital bed. None of it made sense to me, even when I watched her funeral in one of the dreams. The last dream I ever had was the boyfriend assaulting the oldest daughter, and throughout that entire horrifying scene, I could hear the woman's voice begging me to tell her daughter that she was sorry, saying she should have listened. When I woke up, I was extremely panicked, not only because of what I had seen, but because the woman had called out to me by name. I finally went to my mom and started talking very fast, trying to explain everything, and my mom just stood there in shock as I described my dreams and unknowingly her own childhood memories. When I reached the part about the apology, she began to sob uncontrollably. It is important to note that my mother had never told me anything about my grandmother or her childhood before these dreams, and I had never even seen a photograph of her. Story 6. About a year and a half ago, my best friend of over 15 years and I took a late-night trip out to my family farm after getting out of our second shift job. It was a clear, crisp, early fall night in Michigan, and we were sitting there talking casually and watching the night sky when he asked me a very strange question. He said the place had always felt unsettling, almost like someone was watching, and asked if something bad had ever happened there. I laughed a little and told him I only knew the stories my father had told me, then explained how my great-grandfather bought the farm in the early 1930s and how it became a big family effort to keep it running. Relatives would come help with chores in exchange for being allowed to hunt on the land for food. One day, my great-grandfather's cousin came to help out and later asked if he could go hunting that night, which he was allowed to do, so he set out shortly after sundown. The next morning, my great-grandfather noticed that his vehicle was still in the driveway, even though he should have left hours earlier. Although it was still dark, he knew the area where his cousin would have been hunting and went out to look for him. As he reached the back pasture and came around a bend, he called out his cousin's name and heard a strange but familiar voice answer him. He later said that the sound chilled him to the bone and that something felt very wrong. When he called out again, the voice no longer sounded human, almost like a growl mimicking his cousin. He ran out of there without looking back. When the sun came up, he gathered a large group of relatives and farm workers to search the land. They found his cousin's gun, still loaded and never fired, his hat covered in a dark brown substance, and nothing else. My great-grandfather searched for any sign of him for over 60 years, and my dad said the only time he ever held on to hope was when the swamp in the pasture where his cousin had been hunting eventually dried up. There is much more to this story, but for now, this is where it ends. Story 7. My high school teacher once told us a story about a friend of his who lived in rural Arkansas. This friend met a girl while she was working at the Walmart register. They talked, hit it off really well, and she seemed like exactly the kind of person he wanted to be with, a kind, religious girl. They exchanged phone numbers, started talking regularly, had long conversations late into the night, and went on several dates, and she genuinely seemed very nice. She ended every phone call with a short prayer, thanking their heavenly Father, or something similar, and the guy became completely infatuated with her. Eventually, she called him and invited him to her house at 7:30 on a Saturday night, but she was very specific, telling him to arrive at exactly 7:30 and not a minute later, warning him that if he was even 1 minute late, she would break up with him. The man was a Little League baseball coach and had a game scheduled that day, but since it was supposed to end a few hours earlier, he agreed. On the day of the game, it went longer than expected, and although he started getting nervous, he still thought he had enough time. When the game finally ended, three of the children's parents had not arrived yet, and he had to take them home himself. Panicking because he did not want to ruin his chance with the girl, he rushed the kids into his car and drove off quickly. After dropping off the first two children, he realized the third child's home was too far out of the way, so he made the terrible decision to leave the child on the road and beg him to walk home. He then rushed back to his own place, showered, changed clothes, and headed straight to the girl's house as fast as he could. He arrived at 7:35, 5 minutes late, and a woman in her mid-40s answered the door and told him that Clarice, the girl he had been seeing, said he was late and wanted him to leave. Completely dejected, he went back home. The next day, he saw a news report showing a house that looked very familiar, which turned out to be the girl's home, and police were leading a handcuffed woman out, the same woman who had spoken to him the night before, with the girl following behind her. The headline mentioned child kidnappers, or something similar, and he immediately feared the police would come speak to him because of his connection to the girl. Soon enough, an officer arrived at his house and asked if he was the man in question, and although he was terrified, he calmly asked whether he needed a lawyer. The officer said he was not legally allowed to explain everything, but felt a moral obligation to warn him. He told him that the women had been involved in human sacrifice, that inside the house, police found the remains of missing children, blood covering the walls, and jars containing hearts labeled with the children's names. There was also one empty jar, and it had his name written on it. The girl had invited him to her house at exactly 7:30 so they could kill him as part of a ritual sacrifice. And the ritual required precise timing, meaning that being late by 5 minutes had saved his life. Story 8. A friend of mine told me this story about a month after his mother passed away. She had died from a heart attack while taking a walk in their back garden, and there were no suspicious circumstances. Everything seemed normal at first. For about a month after her death, nothing unusual happened in the house. But then my friend claimed strange things began to occur. The garden where she had died suddenly stopped thriving, with all the plants dying despite being watered regularly, and throughout the house they began hearing unexplained noises and the sound of objects being knocked over. One night he was woken by one of these sounds, and he walked from his bedroom to the kitchen to get a glass of water and clear his head. As he turned the corner, he swore he saw his mother standing at the stove cooking something, and he could even smell the food. The apparition turned around, looked directly at him, and smiled. He slowly backed away, wanting to scream or run, but feeling completely frozen. The figure then walked out the back door onto the deck and motioned for him to follow, and somehow he did. The apparition led him into the back garden, to the exact spot where his mother had collapsed and died, and stood there for about 10 minutes while my friend watched silently, terrified and unable to move. Eventually the figure disappeared, and he stayed outside for a few more minutes before going back inside and trying to sleep. By morning, he convinced himself it had just been a nightmare. But when he went out into the garden, on the exact spot where the figure had stood, there was a cluster of 5 roses growing, one for each member of the family: himself, his sister, his older brother, their father, and even one for the family dog. At first, I did not believe him until he sent me a picture of the roses, surrounded by the rest of the dead plants. And although I no longer have the image, the story still gives me chills every time I think about it. Story 9. I hope this does not get buried, but this happened to my parents about 20 years ago. They were driving out to Death Valley for a hotel stay over a winter weekend, having left late in the day and planning to arrive at night. The hotel was about 30 minutes outside the actual town center of Death Valley, and when they finally reached the location, the place appeared completely abandoned. My mom, who scares easily, did not want to get out of the car, but my dad enjoys strange situations and decided to investigate. As soon as he walked around the back of the building, a man suddenly approached my mother's side of the car and claimed his motorcycle had broken down and that he delivered newspapers to Death Valley. My mom looked around and saw no motorcycle anywhere, and there was absolutely nothing nearby, no other buildings at all. The man began begging her to take the newspapers and deliver them to a hotel in town, saying he would lose his job otherwise. He was holding a stack of papers and insisted she open the door so he could hand them to her. At that point, my mom got very bad vibes from him, refused, locked all the doors, and told him to leave, but he kept begging. When my dad finally came back around the corner, the man panicked, quickly shoved the newspapers into my dad's hands and walked away. As they drove off, they watched him walking straight out into the desert. They eventually reached the hotel to drop off the papers and decided to book a room there. But when they handed the newspapers to the woman at the front desk, she told them that the hotel did not receive newspaper deliveries at all. My parents then opened the stack and looked at the front page, only to realize it was a newspaper dated 1954. Story 10. Back when I was in about 5th grade, I discovered a Pokemon-themed chat room through Yahoo, and within it, there were around 15 regular users, mostly between 12 and 16 years old, and we spent a lot of time role-playing anime characters and storylines. Over time, I got to know a few of them well enough to chat through America Online Instant Messenger and even talk on the phone, and some of those friendships lasted 4 or 5 years. One of the guys I got close to was a bit eccentric and absolutely loved creature and monster models and stories, things like Godzilla and Spawn, and he believed in creatures like chupacabras, which I thought was silly but did not really question. He lived out in a very rural area in a Midwestern state, which to my young West Coast mind seemed extremely isolated. After years of knowing him and spending well over 100 hours talking on the phone, he finally shared something deeply disturbing with me. He told me that sometimes he would black out and wake up to discover that he had been, or was still in the process of, harming animals and even children, explaining that he had cousins and neighborhood kids nearby and had apparently killed some animals during these episodes. Hearing this made me feel physically sick because I love animals, and the information terrified me, especially since he told me I was one of the only people he had ever trusted enough to tell. Then the story became even stranger when he explained that someone in his family, or possibly a family friend, believed he was possessed by a demon and decided an exorcism was necessary. It was done at night in a dark room lit only by candles, and he was tied to the bed because they did not know how the demon might react. As he described this part, his voice was shaking with fear and emotion, and he explained that during the ritual, they heard something hit the floor beneath the bed as the demon supposedly left his body, followed by the sound of something scrambling across the floor and out of the room, leaving claw marks in the wooden floor. He was completely serious when he told me that this experience cured him and that he never hurt anyone or anything again. And after hearing all of this, I immediately distanced myself from him as quickly as possible. Story 11. When I was a kid, my family moved into a new house, and one of my earliest memories was that my brother's room was always extremely cold, though at the time I never thought much of it. As I got older, I eventually moved into that same room, but it was no longer cold. When I asked my mom about it, she told me that when we first moved in, my sister had actually taken that room. And during that time, she suffered from constant nightmares. And when she woke up, she would have bruises on her legs and stomach. My mom also experienced recurring nightmares of a woman telling her to leave the house. And after she performed some kind of ritual, everything stopped, including the room being cold. A few years later, when my sister was getting married, my grandmother and 3 female cousins whom I had never met before came to stay with us. My mom told me that my grandmother never liked staying in our house because she would always get sick when she visited. My 3 cousins stayed in my sister's room, and after their second night there, they were terrified and said that someone kept trying to open their door, claiming they saw the doorknob moving. But every time they opened it, no one was there. They came into my room and asked if they could sleep there, and I thought they were just trying to scare me, but I agreed. I slept on the floor while they took my bunk bed, and not long after, I heard the washing machine turn on. The laundry room was right next to my room, so I went out and turned it off, then went back to bed, but shortly after that, I heard the sound of chains dragging outside my door. When I opened it, no one was there, and although this really scared me, I eventually managed to fall asleep. The next morning, out of curiosity, I went to check my sister's room, and when I opened the door, I saw two things that terrified me. Faint black marks on the ceiling that looked like footprints, and the window was open. What made that especially frightening was that the second pane of glass had been installed incorrectly, meaning the window could only be opened from the outside. And since we lived on the second floor, it would have been impossible without a ladder. After everyone left, nothing strange happened again. And when I talked to my mom about it, she told me the house did not like new people, especially women, which explained why I never experienced much myself and why my grandmother always got sick there. After that, once in a while sleeping, I would hear a baby crying, and I always assumed it was the neighbor's baby. When we eventually moved out, my mom made me say goodbye to all the neighbors, even ones I had never spoken to. And when I mentioned the baby crying to the family next door, they told me they did not have a baby. About 7 years after moving away, I went back to visit the house and saw that my old room was much larger. When I asked the current owner why, they told me that the closet in my room had a hidden space behind it, making it twice as large. They said they did not find anything inside, but learning that years later just added one more unsettling detail to everything that happened in that house. Story 12. The house I grew up in was very old and always gave me an unsettling feeling, and while we lived there, a lot of strange things happened. My sister, who was about 2 or 3 years old at the time, would say things that were especially disturbing. One time while she was sitting on the couch watching a movie with my mom, she pointed up at the ceiling and said she wanted to go up there. And when my mom asked where she meant, she said she wanted to be with the people up there because they were nice to her. No one else saw anything, and we were too frightened to ask her more. Around the same time, while my dad was giving her a bath, she asked him if he remembered when she used to take care of him and my mom. And when he asked what she meant, she said she remembered when they were little and that she took care of them. That alone was enough to scare him badly. I personally had an out-of-body experience in that house when I was 7 years old. And one night we even called the police because we heard glass breaking and footsteps moving through the house. There were loud sounds of things tearing and crashing, and my family was so scared that we locked ourselves together in one bedroom. When the police arrived, they found no one there, nothing broken, and everything completely normal. Even now, every time I drive past that house, I get an overwhelming sense of dread. Story 13. Paranormal activity has always been strange to me, and from a scientific standpoint, I tend to dismiss it. But I grew up in a house where things happened that I still cannot explain, so I try not to dwell on it, much like trying not to think about how the universe has no edge. The house was an old one in New Zealand, and my family lived there for about 5 years, during which many unsettling events occurred. Doors would slam shut without any breeze, and my sisters and I often heard footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. One night, my entire family was woken by a loud crash, and when we went to investigate, we found a vase shattered in the middle of the bathroom floor. It had been sitting on the windowsill above the sink, where it should have fallen into the basin, but instead it somehow landed and broke several feet away in the center of the room. My mother also frequently said she would wake up feeling someone breathing directly on her face. The most terrifying experience for me happened when I was 7 years old and woke up in my bedroom, where my bed sat in the middle of the room, and I could clearly hear a man breathing heavily, as if he were lying on the floor next to my bed. I had experienced asthma attacks before, and tried to convince myself it was just my own breathing, but even after holding my breath for a long time, I could still hear the sound. I was too scared to look down, but thankfully whatever it was not between me and the door. After about 10 minutes of sheer terror, I gathered the courage to run out of the room, screaming and crying to my parents' bedroom, and I slept in my mother's bed for the rest of the night. Story 14. A few years ago, I took a summer-long trip where I stayed overnight at different people's houses. When my friend and I arrived at one house, we met a husband and wife who had 2 sons in the military and 2 young daughters who had been adopted from a tribal country that I cannot quite remember. We asked about their daughters, and the mother told us that the girls were very kind children when they were adopted, except when they were taken to church. During church services, the girls would suddenly act wildly, yelling and screaming and behaving completely differently from their normal selves. Eventually, the girls learned about Christianity, and the behavior stopped entirely, and the parents believed the girls had previously been demon-possessed. That night, I slept in the house on the top bunk of a bunk bed, with my friend sleeping on the bed below me. I had completely forgotten the story I had been told and did not even think about it until after what happened. As I lay there, I suddenly felt that something was very wrong in the room, and then my bed started shaking. At first, I tried to rationalize it and assumed it was my friend moving around, so I woke him up and asked if he was shaking the bed, but he said no. I then asked if he could feel the bed shaking at all, and he said he could not. I could still clearly feel the bed shaking, and I became genuinely scared. I closed my eyes and tried as hard as I could to ignore it, and eventually I fell asleep. The next morning I told my friend what I had experienced, and he told me that he had also felt that something was very wrong in the room that night. I never actually saw anything, but it remains one of the most frightening experiences of my life. Story 15. When my cousin was around 7 years old, his bedroom was in the basement, which was half underground and half above ground, and his bed was positioned right next to a window. One night, without warning, he woke up and opened his eyes to see a man crouched just outside the window, staring directly at him. He froze in fear, unsure what to do, then eventually turned over in bed so his back was facing the window and somehow managed to fall asleep. This continued for some time, with the stranger appearing on random nights, standing outside the window and staring at him, and sometimes even tapping on the glass with his finger. On the wall opposite the window, there was a mirror, and one night after my cousin noticed the stranger again and turned away to avoid looking at him, the man shined a flashlight, reflecting the beam off the mirror to illuminate my cousin's face, as if to let him know he could still see him. The worst incident happened when the stranger finally became bold enough to push on the window to see if it would open, but thankfully it was locked. To this day, my cousin has no idea who the man was, what he wanted, or what might have happened if the window had been unlocked that night. And even now, at 31 years old, he has still never told his parents about it. Story 16. I am about as non-religious as a person can be, and like many people, I tend to trust science and logic over anything supernatural. But this is the one experience in my life that still makes me question everything. When I was around 6 years old, living in our old house, I shared a bedroom with my sister, who was about 4 at the time. Our beds were against the same wall, separated by a small nightstand, and the room was square in shape, connected to the rest of the house by a long hallway. One night I woke up, unsure of the time, but it felt late because the nearby highway sounded unusually quiet. As I shifted in my bed, I opened my eyes and looked up at the ceiling, where I saw two small child-like figures floating about 4 feet away from me. They were greenish in color, with edges that did not clearly separate them from the space around them, and they giggled when they noticed that I was looking at them. I could not tell if the giggling was friendly or threatening, so I assumed I was still half asleep and closed my eyes, expecting them to disappear. When I opened my eyes again, they were still there, only closer. I tried again, closing my eyes and reopening them, and they were closer still, now only about 2.5 feet away. At that point I panicked, jumped out of my bed, and ran toward the door and into the hallway, stopping briefly to look back. When I did, they turned their heads toward me, as if startled that I was leaving. I ran straight into my mother's bedroom, climbed into her bed shaking, and slept there for the rest of the night. To this day, I regret leaving my sister alone in that room, but I was too terrified to think clearly. I have only told a few people about this experience, but years later, a friend's cousin independently described a childhood experience involving small floating children that were dimly glowing green, without knowing anything about my story. And even now, remembering it makes me deeply uncomfortable. Story 17. I was very young, so I do not remember this at all, but my parents have told me this story many times, and they firmly believe it happened exactly as they describe it. My parents, my older brother, and I went apple picking one year, and my parents decided to visit a different orchard instead of the one they had gone to for years. On the way, they apparently stopped for gas at an old-fashioned convenience store. While my dad was filling the tank, my mom went inside to look for snacks, and she later said that everything in the store looked old but somehow still fresh, like snacks from another era. She did not buy anything, but she did chat with an elderly clerk behind the counter while paying for the gas. We then left and continued on to have what my parents described as a wonderful day picking apples, including Granny Smith apples. On the way home, my dad decided to stop at the same convenience store again for gas. But when we arrived, the building was boarded up and looked like it had been abandoned for a very long time. Confused, my dad drove a few miles down the road to a Sunoco at a rest stop to get gas instead. While there, he struck up a conversation with an older man working there. And during the conversation, my dad mentioned the boarded-up convenience store. The man told him that the store had been abandoned for over 50 years after the owner, an elderly man who perfectly matched the description of the clerk my mom had spoken to, was shot and killed during a robbery. I am 22 years old now and do not personally believe the story, but my parents swear it happened exactly that way, and they said they did not speak a single word to each other for the entire drive home because they were so shaken. Story 18. I have no memory of this, but my very rational parents still swear it is true 45 years later. I should start by saying that I am an identical twin, and when I was 3 years old, we lived in Liverpool, England. Although it was about 20 years after the end of the Second World War, the city and countryside were still full of collapsed and burned-out buildings. One summer, we vacationed at a seaside camping park and stayed in a small camper with tiny bedrooms at each end and a shared living space in the middle, with my twin and me at one end and my parents at the other. One night, I woke up screaming and completely terrified, shouting about a lady who was trying to hurt us. And according to my parents, I described in disturbing detail a woman covered in blood, carrying an axe, and wanting to harm all of us. When my parents tried to take me to their side of the camper, I became hysterical and screamed for my twin, desperately trying to wake him so the lady would not get him. I was so upset that the only way they could calm me was to bring both of us twins into their bed, and I spent the entire night shaking and staring at the bedroom door. The next morning, my dad went to the campground store to buy cigarettes and ended up talking with the shopkeeper. After noticing the outline of a large foundation in the grass nearby, he asked if it had been bombed during the war, and the shopkeeper told him no, explaining that the building had burned down after the owner was murdered, saying that the woman who owned it had been stabbed by her husband and then chopped him to pieces with a hatchet before later dying herself. My dad said that hearing this nearly made him lose control on the spot. Story 19. When I was a little girl, my dad had a job that required us to move between different states frequently, and we eventually ended up in a small town in Virginia when I was 5 years old and my sister was 4. We rented a very old house on Church Street, and almost immediately after moving in, my sister and I began having intense night terrors. That alone was not unusual, but what was strange was that we could not be woken up. We were completely hysterical, and we were having the same dreams. We would scream for our mother, but she could not comfort us because we would fight her, crying about dead people, saying we were going to die, and that we did not want to die. This terrified my mother, and she told our new neighbors about what was happening. They were deeply unsettled and explained that Church Street had earned its name because hundreds of years earlier, it had been part of the town church's property, and during a severe cholera outbreak, so many people died that there was no room left in the cemetery. So a massive pit was dug, and the bodies were thrown in. Eventually, the mass grave was paved over and became the street itself. My mother, who is normally logical and not easily frightened, threatened my father with divorce if he did not move us out of that area. She truly believes that my sister and I were being haunted, and that the spirits of 2 little girls who had died and been thrown into the mass grave were trying to take over us. She rarely talks about it now, and honestly, I am fine with that. Story 20. My grandmother once told me a story about her uncle, who was a trader living along the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, back before cars were commonly used in that part of the world. He transported his goods using camels and donkeys, and one night, while traveling alone through the desert with 2 camels and a donkey, he heard someone call his name. When he turned to see who it was, he claimed he saw beings so tall that their heads appeared to touch the clouds. Terrified, he immediately abandoned his camels and fled using only his donkey. When he reached his sister's house a couple of hours later, he told her what he had seen, and complained that he was in severe pain. About 2 hours after arriving, he died. When his body was washed for burial, as is customary in Islam where burials usually take place within 24 hours or less, they discovered a single handprint stretched across his entire back, from his right thigh all the way up to his left shoulder, as if made by one enormous hand, which deeply unsettled everyone who saw it. In addition to that story, my family also believes my brother was possessed as an infant. He refused to eat, cried whenever the lights were on, and when the lights were off and my parents were not in the room, he would babble in baby language as if talking to something unseen. If my parents were present in the dark room, he would remain unnaturally quiet. They eventually took him to a Muslim exorcist, and after whatever was inside him was supposedly driven out, he immediately drank 3 bottles of milk and drained my mother completely while feeding, despite having barely eaten anything for almost 3 days. Story 21. My friend and I went hiking late one evening, just before sunset, and decided to climb a hill to explore. While we were hanging out near the top, it suddenly started raining. Not a normal rain, but something that felt more like a violent storm, almost like being caught in a hurricane. Since the sun was going down and already hidden behind heavy rain clouds, we decided to head back. As we made our way downhill, we thought we heard footsteps behind us but assumed it was just the storm. At some point we realized we had gone down the wrong side of the hill, and by the time we found our way back to the main trail, it was completely dark and incredibly unsettling. We continued walking toward my car when we both started to feel like we were being hunted. The rain had mostly stopped by then, making it easier to hear, and we could clearly hear twigs snapping and footsteps, not just one set, but several. We could not tell if it was people following us or possibly wild animals like mountain lions. But either way, we hurried as fast as we could back to the car. Once we got inside, dried off, and started talking about what had just happened, we noticed a man sitting alone in a car parked about 20 feet away from us. We were certain that car had been empty when we walked past it, and we had not seen anyone approach it after we got into ours. From where we sat, it looked like the man was simply staring straight at our vehicle, not reading or looking down at anything. After about 10 minutes of silently watching him through the mirrors, he turned on his headlights, waited another 10 minutes, and then slowly drove away. Story 22. My uncle is a pastor at a church in Oklahoma, and one of his closest friends is a youth minister at a church in a nearby town. This man has a wife and a young daughter, and when the daughter was around 5 or 6 years old, she and her mother would wake up early every Saturday morning to cook breakfast together. One morning, the daughter woke up and saw the kitchen light turn on from her bedroom and heard pots and pans being moved around, so she wondered why her mother was starting breakfast without her. She got out of bed to check, but it was around 4 in the morning, and when she reached the kitchen, no one was there, and all the lights were off. She went into her parents' room and asked her mother why she had started breakfast without her, and her mother assumed it must have been her daughter making the noise. Confused and alarmed, she woke her husband, thinking someone else might be in the house. He grabbed an old aluminum baseball bat and began checking the dark rooms. When he reached the kitchen, he saw that some pots and pans were out, but nothing else seemed disturbed. Next to the kitchen was a small reading room with a couch and a rocking chair, and as he stepped inside, he could barely make out the rocking chair moving rapidly back and forth with no one sitting in it. Startled, he stepped back, grabbed a Bible from a nearby shelf, and shouted for whatever was there to leave his house in the name of Jesus. And according to him, the rocking chair stopped instantly. Nothing like that ever happened in the house again. Story 23. When I was around 18, one of my friends lived in a house about 3 miles outside the village where the rest of us lived. The house sat right next to a motorway and had a large amount of land attached to it, because his parents ran a horse stable in one of the nearby fields. His parents had gone on holiday, and we were planning to have a small party at his place, around 20 to 30 people. A few of us met up in the village and walked along the country roads to his house, which took about 30 minutes. When we arrived, we were surprised to see 2 police cars parked in the driveway, and at first we assumed the party had already started and that the police had been called for some reason. What had actually happened was much stranger. Our friend had been home alone eating dinner while waiting for people to arrive when he noticed someone standing at the bottom of the garden, just outside the range of the porch light, watching him. Thinking it was one of us trying to mess with him, he slipped out the side door to try to sneak around and surprise whoever it was. After searching outside and not finding anyone, he headed back toward the house, expecting to see us inside. But instead, when he looked through the kitchen window, he saw an unknown man sitting at his table, calmly finishing the dinner he had been eating. He later said the man looked dirty, unkempt, and clearly did not belong there. Terrified, my friend ran all the way to his nearest neighbor's house and called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the house and surrounding property with dogs but never found anyone. The incident scared him badly, and several of us ended up staying at his house for about a week until his parents returned. Story 24. My sister teaches third grade at a school with many children from lower income families, and this is one of the stories she told me. One of her students, who was usually a very good and responsible child, suddenly started having trouble staying awake in class. Concerned, my sister spoke to her during recess and asked what was wrong, but the girl refused to say anything. Eventually, my sister mentioned it to another teacher who knew the family better, and that teacher shared what she had heard. The girl was known for being serious and honest, never making up strange stories for attention or lying like other kids her age. According to her parents, the girl had started telling her mother that every night a young girl with dirty hair and dirty fingernails would come out of her closet and play with her toys. The mother had been scolding her for not putting her toys away because she kept finding them out in the morning. But the child insisted she had cleaned up and that the dirty girl had taken the toys out again. She described the closet door slowly opening each night, the girl coming out to play, and herself hiding under the covers, listening in fear. That alone was disturbing, but there was more. One night, the family came home from a movie later than the girl's usual bedtime, and everyone went straight to sleep. Not long after, the girl came to her parents' door crying, shaking, and begging to sleep with them. She told them that when she had turned on the light in her room, she found the dirty girl asleep in her bed. Story 25. One summer when I was about 16, I took a job babysitting two young girls from Monday through Friday while their parents worked. I would arrive at their house early in the morning around 6, and their mother would leave for work shortly after. The girls usually slept until around 10, so I would watch television downstairs in the living room until they woke up. At first, the strange things were subtle. A few mornings each week, I would get the strong feeling that someone was standing behind me in the kitchen or at the staircase. I assumed one of the girls was trying to sneak up on me as a prank, so I would walk through the kitchen and quietly go upstairs to catch them. But they were never there. Then one morning while I was watching television, the channels started changing on their own. I thought I was sitting on the remote and searched the couch, but then realized the remote was sitting on the coffee table, untouched. The channels were not changing in order either, but jumping around as if someone were selecting them deliberately. I ran upstairs again, thinking the girls were awake, but they were both still asleep in their rooms. The final incident happened when their mother asked me to help prepare for one of the girls' birthdays by inflating balloons using a small pump. While I was doing this, I got thirsty and set the pump on the kitchen counter next to the refrigerator. After grabbing a drink and closing the refrigerator door, the pump suddenly flew off the counter and slid across the kitchen into the living room. I tried to explain it logically, thinking I must have closed the door too hard. But when I put the pump back and repeated the motion several times, it did not move at all. That evening, when I finally told their mother about everything that had been happening, she went quiet and asked if it had been happening to me too. She then admitted that the television had done the same thing to her, and that the girls sometimes claimed to see children playing in the backyard who were not actually there. She said she had told them not to mention it to me because she did not want to lose another babysitter. Story 26. As a child, I was sick with an unknown illness, and for months I remained bedridden in the hospital with no clear hope of recovery. Eventually, my parents brought me home because they believed I was dying. They later told me that during that time, I spoke in languages I should not have known, addressing people who were no longer alive, including relatives and friends. My mother brought in a priest and another specialist whose exact role I no longer remember, and together they claimed to diagnose the problem, saying I had been made ill by spirits living in our backyard, described as gnomes. Apparently, I used to play outside as if other people were there, and they believed these beings liked me so much that they wanted me to stay with them. To cure me, my mother agreed to a ritual suggested by the specialist. First, the house was blessed, then some kind of agreement was made. As part of this, an offering was required, which included leaving the backyard untouched, cutting my long hair, and another condition I cannot recall. I woke up sometime after that with little to no memory of what had happened. A couple of years later, we moved out suddenly, leaving at night and taking only what we could. Later, my father returned to the house to collect more belongings, and I begged to go with him because I missed my childhood home. When we went inside, all the walls were covered with drawings and writing. I could not read at the time, but there was a small drawing at about my eye level. The walls were filled everywhere except for a clear ring of untouched space, as if everything surrounded one specific spot, and in the center was a drawing of a small man with round white eyes and a beard. Story 27. This is extremely personal, and I have never really shared it because most people would not understand how deeply it affected me. It is the story of a recurring dream I had throughout my entire childhood. There are a few important things to know about my mother's family first. I am Persian, and my great-grandmother had many sons, about 5 that I know of. And what always stood out about this group of brothers was that they all seemed to share the same presence or aura. The dream was always the same. I would walk up a staircase or sometimes slowly ride an elevator, and when I reached the top, I would see a tropical oasis with a blazing sun, as if I were standing on top of a skyscraper in New York, but instead of a city, there was a wild jungle bathed in sunlight. At the top stood a man, and although I never truly knew who he was, he radiated the same aura as my mother's uncles. When I realized he could possibly be one of them, we would both smile and silently watch the sun until he disappeared, and then I would go back down. What made this so unsettling was what happened after I woke up. Every time, my entire body and mind felt an overwhelming need to find this man, as if I were destined to meet him. I have never experienced that kind of emotion after any other dream, and although the feeling would eventually fade once I forced myself back to sleep, it always returned with the dream. The most disturbing part is a real fact about that group of brothers. One of them went missing during the Iran-Iraq War about 30 years ago. His body was never found, he never made contact again, and he is officially listed as missing in action. Story 28. In 2007, I was living with my parents in Alaska while attending college. They lived in a 3-level house in a nice part of the city, with my room on the lowest level, the kitchen and living areas on the middle floor, and my parents' bedroom on the top level. The kitchen was directly above my room, and because it had tile floors, I could always clearly hear when someone was walking around up there. One morning in early March, I was up late working on mathematics homework, and my parents had been asleep for hours, although both sometimes struggled with insomnia. I suddenly heard a door upstairs slam shut, followed by heavy footsteps moving across the kitchen, even sounding like shoes on the floor. I assumed it was my dad awake and thought about going up to keep him company. But as I stepped out of my room, I was hit with a powerful feeling that something was wrong. Instead of going upstairs, I locked myself in the bathroom and called our landline from my cell phone. My father answered and, sounding irritated, asked why I was stomping around the kitchen. My parents then came downstairs and together we searched the entire house. There was no sign of anyone else being there. All the doors and windows were locked, nothing was broken, and although there was snow outside, there were no footprints around the house and no water or dirt in the kitchen. What unsettled me the most was that intense feeling of danger I had when I first left my room. Hearing someone in the kitchen late at night was completely normal in our house, and I often went upstairs to join one of my parents when they could not sleep. I still sometimes wonder what I might have seen or encountered if I had ignored that feeling, or if it had never occurred at all. Story 29. Around 10 to 12 years ago, I was in high school and living with my mom, who had recently gone through a divorce, and my younger brother. We often heard what sounded like footsteps on the second floor of our house, usually ending with creaking noises in my mom's bedroom, which I always assumed was just the house settling. I frequently stayed up very late into the early hours of the morning, playing computer games or watching television, and my mom, who worked from home, was also a night owl and would often work downstairs, either in the kitchen or in a spare bedroom directly beneath my room. Whenever she was down there, I would hear the muffled sound of her talking on the phone. Not clearly, just the low, indistinct noise you would expect to hear through the floor. One night during summer break, I stayed up late and clearly heard her talking downstairs for hours, which struck me as odd because it went on well past 2 or 3 in the morning. Around 4 in the morning, I distinctly heard her come up the stairs and walk into her bedroom to go to sleep. I went to bed shortly after and did not think much of it. The next day, I woke up around 1 in the afternoon and went downstairs, where I found her in the kitchen doing paperwork. I casually mentioned that she had been up very late the night before, and she looked confused and asked what I meant. I told her I had heard her talking on the phone all night and heard her come upstairs shortly before I went to sleep. She then told me she had gone to bed around 9:30 in the evening because she had to meet a client early the next morning. Feeling unsettled, I asked her again if she was sure, because I was positive I had heard her awake until at least 3 in the morning and had heard her come upstairs. She reassured me that she had absolutely been asleep for hours by then. I did not have the television on that night, and the volume on my game was low so I would not wake my brother. But I know I heard talking and footsteps. That house always made me uncomfortable for reasons I could never quite explain, but that experience was the most disturbing of all. We moved out not long after, and I have never experienced anything like that since. Story 30. A group of friends and I once decided to explore an old abandoned house that had a disturbing reputation. According to local stories, before it was boarded up, the house had belonged to a father and his young daughter, and the daughter had suffered severe abuse. One day she was reportedly chased down the road by her father and attacked near a creek, where her body was found the same day. A couple of my friends used to spend time near that creek and claimed they sometimes saw her in the nearby forest, though I did not believe any of it. When we went inside the abandoned house, nothing unusual happened at first. We found a few dead rats, and the basement was full of broken furniture and debris. As we were leaving and stepping back onto the road toward the truck, I turned around and noticed something moving in the front yard. From what I remember, it looked like a human-shaped figure about 6 feet tall, wearing what appeared to be a dress or skirt. I could tell it was a solid figure because it blocked my view of the field behind it. I immediately panicked and left, and my friends followed. Out of the 5 of us there that night, 2 of my friends later described seeing the same thing I had seen, and we all agreed the descriptions matched. It could have been a homeless person living nearby, and I will never know for sure, but the memory still gives me chills. What makes it even stranger is that the girl in the original story was said to be only 7 years old, yet the figure we saw was around my height and far taller than a child. Story 31. I can give you creepy, and I am sorry in advance because this is long, but it is entirely true. The house I was raised in had been standing for over 100 years and had gone from a single-family house to a duplex and then back into a house before my parents bought it. Being the youngest child in my family made everything stranger, especially since we lived next to train tracks, which always seemed to carry some kind of chaos with them. I knew there were several spirits in that house because something was always happening, and I could see fear in my siblings' eyes even though they tried to explain things away for my sake. When you are the youngest and you talk about things that are not visibly there, your family either thinks you are lying or that you have an overly vivid imagination, so I learned early on to keep my mouth shut. By the time I was the only child left living at home with my parents, I was considered a level-headed teenage girl by their very religious standards. So one day I dropped a massive bomb on them and told them about the 2 ghosts who slept with me. One stayed upstairs, a boy named Nikolai dressed in paperboy-style clothes from the 1920s, and the other stayed downstairs, a girl named Vanessa dressed in a Victorian-style dress. My mom completely lost it and thought I was making it up, while my dad sat with me for 2 hours talking about ghosts, spirits, angels, and demons, and then told me never to mention it to my mom again. Fast forward from age 15 to age 20, and I was dating a guy I will call Mulletman, who had a deeply troubled family history that he rarely talked about and only half believed in anything paranormal. One day he was at my house with 2 close friends of mine who were full believers, and in the middle of a conversation I abruptly stopped and told Mulletman that his grandpa said hello. He looked unsettled and asked how I knew it was him, and I told him that his grandfather said he had been watching over him and helping him, that I could see him wearing an old army-style uniform with jingling dog tags, and that both his grandparents said they had saved something valuable for him in a box to help him financially later in life. This completely broke him down because I had never seen a picture of his grandparents. Yet I described them perfectly and mentioned conversations he had never told me about. It scared him badly, but also meant a lot to him. My two friends confirmed they felt two positive presences in the room, and afterward we all went out for ice cream. When we returned, Mulletman left for work, and within 5 minutes of him leaving, my female friend suddenly hissed in pain, arched her back, and ripped off her shirt to reveal 6 to 8 fresh scratches across her back, 3 of them bleeding. After that, my original two ghost companions said they would try to protect me while I went through the house, blessing everything thoroughly. And once that was done, the negativity stopped and it became easier to deal with the spirits that seemed to arrive whenever the trains passed by. Story 32. I used to live in an old Victorian house where all kinds of strange things happened. But my family's extremely skeptical, so whenever something weird occurred, we usually just ignored it and carried on. One day I walked into the living room and saw my dog standing in the corner growling at absolutely nothing. I thought little of it and sat down on the couch. But my dog came over and sat directly in front of me, never taking her eyes off that corner. She would calm down for a moment, then suddenly tense up again and growl. I nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw a shadow flicker in that same corner in the mirror opposite, even though there was no possible way for a shadow to be there at that time of day. It felt like whenever the shadow moved, my dog would growl to force it back. Sadly, my dog passed away a few years later. But a while after that, something else happened. I was staying overnight in my sister's room in the garden, a summer house my dad had built and converted into a bedroom, because I did not want to disturb my parents after staying out late and my sister was not home. About an hour later, I heard footsteps outside, even though the garden was difficult to access, and I knew I had locked the gate. I sat there panicking with the light on as the footsteps came closer, and the motion sensor lights never activated, which made it worse. The doors were locked, so no one could get in, and then I heard barking outside that sounded exactly like my dog. As soon as the barking and growling started, the footsteps retreated. When everything went quiet, I jokingly called out my dog's name, and in response I heard the familiar sound of tail thumping and a happy yip. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, there was nothing there. Other strange things continued over time, like pictures falling off the walls, unexplained scratching at night, and fleeting shapes appearing in mirrors, none of which could be blamed on the dog. Story 33. In our old house when I was 12, we decided to remodel the basement shortly after moving in, tearing down walls and removing the drop ceiling to create more headroom. One day, while I was downstairs alone taking ceiling panels down, I found a book hidden up in the ceiling and immediately ran upstairs to tell my mom. She took the book down and discovered it was a voodoo book, with photos of naked people placed between the pages. And that was when the strange things in the house began. Doors started opening and closing on their own regularly, but 3 events stand out the most. The first involved my baby brother, who was about 8 or 9 months old at the time, and a rattle filled with small beads that made noise very easily. One day it was sitting in the middle of the floor and suddenly moved on its own, so I yelled for my mom and stepdad. They said it probably moved because I walked nearby, so they stomped around and walked close to it, trying to make it move, but it would not budge. After a few minutes of talking, I finally said I was just going to go to bed, and the moment I said that, the rattle moved. Another incident happened one night when we came home from my grandmother's house. I went into the living room and turned on the television before bed, and I could see into my mom's room where she had a swing for my little brother. It was the kind of swing that required cranking an arm several times to get it moving, otherwise it would not move at all. When I looked in her room, the swing was moving at full force, and the strangest part was that it was positioned right next to the wall, where it normally would have hit the wall as it swung, but instead it moved freely without touching anything. The creepiest event of all happened when my grandmother was watching my brother one day. She went downstairs to do a load of laundry and left him upstairs in the living room. We used large stereo speakers that weighed around 50 to 60 pounds, placed between the wall and our sectional couch, to block my brother from crawling out of the living room and hurting himself. She laid the speaker down, went downstairs, and then heard loud stomping upstairs like someone was trying to get her attention. She ran to the stairs and saw my brother sitting at the very top. She grabbed him and went back into the living room, where she found the heavy speakers shoved completely out of the way and pressed up against the wall.